Thank you very much for this introduction. Good morning, everyone. And before I start, I would like to say that I'm really happy to be here with you. Such a wonderful group of people. So thanks a lot to Future Earth for the invitation. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about power and justice in transformation in the context of adaptation to climate change. So a lot of things to say about power and justice. I have only 25 minutes, so it will be just a little bit of information on that. So why adaptation to climate change and why transformation? You already know that we have big challenges with climate change, and especially, with both adaptation and mitigation. And there have been a lot of calls for transformation to adapt to climate change. There are many typologies of action, like this one you see on the right, from coping strategies to adaptation that is incremental and adaptation that is transformative. So a lot of discussions also on definitions on what transformative adaptation is, but I won't go into those definitions. You can check this paper by Giacomo Fedeli. But what we need to know is what makes transformation possible, and also what are the implications of those transformations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So to do that, I would like to present to you a place-based socio-ecological research. So what I mean by place-based is a research that's focused on a given place, where we spend a lot of time. In this case, I spent 7 years in Peru working in this place. And so we use different lenses or perspectives on this same system. Here the system is a social ecological system, which is a watershed in the Peruvian Andes. And we have worked there during 7 years. When I say we, I mean a group of scientists and students from Peru and Europe. Okay, so it's important to define who we are. So today I'm going to show how we can use different lenses on the same system to gain understanding of transformation processes. So I will present different research questions, analytical frameworks, and of course findings. So, but as I'm going to talk about the same system during all the presentation, I would like to present it very quickly. So this watershed is located in the Andes in Peru. In the lower part of the watershed there is a city called Abancay, and all around mountains. This part of the mountains there is a glacier at like 5,000 meters high, a national park, native forests. In this part, a lot of lakes in the upper elevation. And in the middle, agriculture, forest plantations, and a diverse mosaic landscape. This is the same representation with a picture, so the downstream city, the glacier and the national park, and the mosaic landscape with agriculture, agroforestry, pastures, and planted forests. What is important to know is that there are very different people actually living upstream and downstream. Upstream, we have local Andean communities practicing small-scale agriculture and livestock raising with a very strong sense of community. And in the downstream part, we have a city where most population lives, but also where the authorities are. There are many climatic challenges in this watershed related to drought, especially. So there are problems of water scarcity for agriculture, but also for the city. And also there is the problem of the glacier melting. So in this context, there have been a lot of discussions on how to adapt to climate change. At the national level, in Lima, for instance, a lot of workshops, a national adaptation plan, but also at the subnational and local level, like regional strategies and local projects. So I consider that those discussions on adaptation are kind of windows of agency where we make, or people make decisions that will decide of the future of the system. So for me, the representation is this one. On this horizontal axis, which is time, we are located here. And our system, our watershed, is represented by this blue circle. there is a process of decision making on how to adapt to climate change, which is a window of agency because we can decide, or people can decide of the future of the system. So the system can go in this representation down, which is going to a maladaptive space if we consider that the vertical axis is adaptation to drought, or can go up to an adaptive space. And then in the future there will be other decisions that will decide of the future of the system again. So in these discussions in the watershed, people are talking about three options for adapting to climate change. The first one is to build dams. So infrastructure, technology, those dams are located in places where there is no or limited infiltration into the soil, so we try to avoid the ecosystem functions, you know, to be able to control more the storage of water, and the water then is piped down to the city. The second option is to build traditional micro-reservoirs. So this is something that is done by the local communities. So they build like kind of small dams, but where in this case infiltration is important because people want to have those water storage not only for the agriculture around the storage, but also to increase infiltration so that the water will be released later in springs and rivers close to the communities. And then finally, the third option is about conserving or restoring ecosystems such as wetlands and native forests, because those wetlands play a very important role in storing water during the rainy season and release it during the dry season. Same for forests, native forests. So we see that we have very different options that we can represent like this in terms of the degree of human intervention, which is quite high for the dam, and in terms of also of the use of ecosystem functions, which is of course higher for the ecosystem conservation and restoration, which what we can call the nature-based solutions. So very different options. So now we'd like to enter and apply my lenses on those options and the adaptation pathways that are associated with. So first, my first lens is about contribution. Why do I mean by that? Is contribution like ecosystem services or nature's contributions to people? You already know this terminology. So what we did is that at the beginning of the research we organized a workshop with representatives of different economic sectors, local communities, urban dwellers and so on to discuss important ecosystem services. So for instance, they say yes, water flow regulation is very important in the watershed, of course, because of drought problems, but also the products from agriculture, food and feed, also the medicinal plants, but also some cultural, so-called cultural ecosystem services like scenic beauty and recreation. So fine, so we started with this kind of lens of ecosystem services or contribution, and we say, okay, if we look at the different options for adaptation, the dam is quite good for water flow regulation because it is done for that. But it's not really an ecosystem services, it's more like a technological substitute for an ecosystem service. But still, it's good for that, but for the rest, nothing. Of course, there is no agricultural production in the dam, no medicinal plants. Scenic beauty and recreation can be discussed, but in this place there is absolutely no tourism around the dams. For the two other options, the picture is different. There is multifunctionality, so you have the flow regulation, but at the same time, like especially in wetlands, you have livestock grazing, you have medicinal plants, also a place for tourism and so on. So the picture is different, and what we see here is that there are ecological trade-offs. When we make a decision about land use, we increase some ecosystem services and we decrease others. They are ecological trade-offs. But what is important to know as well is that those ecological trade-offs are also social trade-offs. Because the benefits or the contributions of those different options are for different people. The dam will provide water to the downstream city, and no other ecosystem services for no one. The micro-reservoir will provide water for local upland communities, but also other ecosystem services such as medicinal plants or fodder. And finally, for the wetland and forest restoration, it's a bit more complicated because we don't know exactly where the water goes. So we assume that the water will be used by both upstream communities and the downstream city. There is a negotiation ongoing in the watershed so that the city will pay the local communities to restore wetlands and forests for improving water regulation. So this is in process. It means that we still have to understand the implication of this. I will go back to that. But also the co-benefits in terms of scenic beauty or medicinal plants, you know, they're for everyone. So it makes a big difference in terms of the beneficiary. So I have used this ecosystem service framing or contribution, but I feel that we don't get the full picture about the implications of those decisions. So I would like to use the second lens, which is attachment. So instead of framing the discussion in ecosystem services, we ask people to talk about their place without any framing. So we talk to men and women, young and less young people, people from the city and the local communities, and we let them express what they wanted about their place. So I'm going to give you 1 minute to read the next slide, where I have 4 quotes, and reflect and try to propose one word that will summarize what comes to your mind about those quotes. Okay, so just give me one word about what you feel when you read those quotes.
Privilege.
Privilege.
Spiritual.
Spiritual.
Poetry.
Poetry.
Connection.
Connections. Yeah.
Connection.
Okay.
Emotion.
Sorry.
Emotion.
Evolution.
Attachment.
Evolution.
Home.
Home.
Attachment.
Attachment. Affect.
Matrimony.
Matrimony.
Belong.
And there are two sense of time.
I said one word. Be careful. Sense of time. Okay. Okay, thank you. So we don't have much time. We could continue and discuss this in details, but for me it was really impressive when I analyzed this data. I was coding the quotes. It was like really like poetry, as you said, and poetry and a lot of emotions. I think it was the first time I was crying during doing the data analysis. You know, like I mean, because it's this attachment and what the people express in those words is so strong. So what I felt is that when we talk about those connections, this attachment, we often talk about the cognitive experience. So the already processed information, like the sense of place, identity, you know, the memories. So it's really processed. What we miss very often is the sensory and the affective experience. Sensory because people were talking about the colors, the light, the sound of the river, and so on. And I mean, touching the flowers and also the affective experience, talking about love, sadness, and a lot of very, very strong emotions that were conveyed in those quotes. So I think it's important to remember, or to not to forget the sensory and the affective experience. Then, the finding of this lens is that the ecosystem service framing doesn't work here. Because with the ecosystem service framing, we have this metaphor of a kind of factory, or you know, a production. So the ecosystem will produce like beauty, and we will receive this beauty and enjoy it. Of course, it doesn't work like this. We also, we are part of this production of the beauty. So this dualism between nature and society and the utilitarianism doesn't work here. So for this, for analyzing those quotes, of course, it doesn't work. And it's also, when we talk about the framing in ecosystem services, there is an issue of recognition, because when we impose this framing, we forget some worldviews. Especially when we work with communities in the Andes, the Andean cosmovision is very different from the ecosystem service framing. So I'm using this picture that we already saw on Tuesday. So finally, not finally, but third lens was about analyzing the decision processes on those adaptation options. We used the very simple VRK perspective. So the value, rules, and knowledge is useful to understand the decision context. By values, I mean what we want, so the deeply held values, what we want in life, for instance. The knowledge, so what do we know about the outcomes of different decisions, and the rules, that what are we allowed to do. The rules can be like social norms or more formal regulations. Okay, I'm gonna give you examples of knowledge, values, and rules. Starting with knowledge. In the watershed, they are project planting fast-growing exotic tree species to address the problem of drought. Like, I have like this communication from the National Forestry Service saying that rural communities plant more than 2,000 pine trees to cope with drought. Yes, great. So what do people know about that, about the outcomes of this action? So if you talk to the Forest Service or the regional authorities, they say, oh, those trees, the pine trees, they produce a lot of wood, and they are also good for water, because all trees are good for water. Yeah, okay. But scientists, or most of the scientists, say no, those fast-growing species, they consume a lot of water, so they tend to reduce water availability. And local communities, they agree mostly with the scientists. They say, okay, pine trees reduce water availability. So you can wonder, why do they plant the trees if they know that it will be reducing water availability? Actually, in this decision process, the knowledge of the authorities dominate, the knowledge of local communities is ignored, and there is a power problem here, is that very often local communities don't dare to contradict the engineer. And this is, by the way, the title of a paper written by an anthropologist in the Andes, and the title is "You Cannot Contradict the Engineer." But at the same time, there are counter powers, because the communities plant the trees, they receive money for that, and then they don't do anything, and the trees die after like 6 months. Okay. So then values, examples of values in those decisions. So I'm talking about values in the broad sense. I don't know if you know the Schwartz values. If you don't know, I mean, there is a reference here. You can look for that. I don't have time to discuss more those values, but it's what is important to us in life, our goals, and so really the deep values. So those values will affect or influence our attitudes and behaviors. So many examples of value or scales of value that we can measure using tools that have been developed in psychology. So we applied those tools a little bit to understand whether people were more like individualistic or communitarian, egalitarian versus hierarchical, and whether they had environmental values or not. And we also tried to understand the attitudes regarding water management. So we observed like a very different set of values among the stakeholders in the watershed. Those people in favor of dams valued more the private benefits, individualism. People in favor of micro-reservoir valued more equality and tradition. And people in favor of wetlands valued more the environment. So it's really, really clear in the results that there were people with different set of values. And regarding rules, I said that we have the VRK, value, rules, and knowledge perspective. So I need to talk about the rules. In the 3 cases of adaptation that are implemented in the watershed, it's also interesting to see that the rules are completely different. It's really top-down, with a decision made by the regional government and international donors in the case of dams. In the case of micro-reservoirs, it's really bottom-up, NGOs talking to local communities. Okay, everybody having a say about that. Okay, and for the wetland and forest, it's still under discussion, but there is hope that it will be a new form of decision-making. Hope, we'll see. Okay, finally, entanglement. Why this word of entanglements? Because everything is connected in this watershed. When we look at those different adaptation actions, this picture is only over 2 kilometers, and we see that the nature-based solutions are there, the dams are there, the micro-reservoir, they are all in the same place. So they are the same people actually behind the actions. So what we did, we tried to understand how those stakeholders were the same in the three interventions, how they interact. So we applied the social network analysis with different types of interactions. I won't go into the details, but to give a sense of the power relationships, especially power over. And we found that the beneficiary of ecosystem contributions and the direct managers, such as the local communities, were less powerful than indirect managers, such as administration. And we also found that strong power asymmetries were associated with conflict. So what does it mean? Power is everywhere, but when we zoom in, if we look at specific places within the watershed, like you have different stakeholders with different value and rules, and their power relationship will determine which decision will be made. So like for instance in the micro-reservoir, the regional government has no power, okay? So at the end, the decision is to go for micro-reservoir. Okay, last lens, time is running. So this is the justice. Why justice? Because you have seen that from the beginning of the presentation, I've given some hints about justice issues. So we tried at the end to put everything together using this environmental justice framework with 3 dimensions: the distributive justice, so who benefits or loses from adaptation decisions; the participation, so who manage adaptation actions, who decides on them; and finally, the recognition justice, so whose views or worldviews or values or knowledge are recognized in adaptation. So when we apply this framework, we realized that we could actually summarize all the pieces of information from this place-based research. So for me, the justice framework is really important to understand the broad picture. So all the pieces of information that we had, we could put them into this framework. Okay, conclusions, because I have only 2 minutes left. So we have applied those different lenses and different methods to understand the trade-offs, the attachments, the value, rules, and knowledge, power, and justice. And at the end, so I showed that the justice framework can really help understand trade-offs in benefit. So this is the distributive justice, the engagement of multiple stakeholders, which is the participatory or procedural justice, and the recognition of their values and knowledge, which is the recognition justice. And finally, I've said that power is really central to what is happening in this watershed. So we could argue that changes in power relationship could be a deep lever for transformative change. But that's not so easy, of course, especially because in this place you have like historical and structural power asymmetry that come from the colonial times, actually, with the domination of local indigenous communities by the colons. And even if it was a long time ago, it's still really present in the power relationships in the watershed. So, and finally, I've talked about adaptation decisions, but was it really transformation that I was talking about? Is it building a dam, a transformation? We could argue that it's kind of business as usual, and the decision, for instance, on dam is perpetuating power asymmetries. So I think what I have discussed here is not really transformation. We have to see more the systemic changes that are needed to implement those adaptation actions in a new way. Like for instance, there is this negotiations on the nature-based solutions, and I said before that there is hope that the discussion will somehow move a little bit the power asymmetries and the injustices in the watershed. Thank you. I would like to thank the contributor of this research that you can see on the slide. Thank you very much.